Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself beneath a forest canopy. The air is still, shaded by tall trunks that have stood for centuries. Bird song drifts above, but below, in the cool soil, another world is unfolding. Beneath your feet lies an unseen web of life, threads of fungi, thinner than a hair, stretching silently through the earth. They touch roots, wrap around them, slip inside them. They link one tree to another, weaving connections we can't see. For decades, scientists have wondered, do trees truly communicate through these networks? Do old giants feed the young, sending them sugars in times of need? Is there a hidden conversation beneath the forest floor, like whispers in the dark? The idea is beautiful. It inspired books, films, even the imagination of storytellers around the world. A wood wide web, they called it, nature's internet. But how much of this is myth, and how much is measurable science? What do we really know about these networks, and what remains a story we've told ourselves? Tonight, let's wander quietly into that hidden underground, not to decide once and for all, but to listen, to learn, and to rest inside the mystery of forests, connected in ways we are only beginning to understand. The story of the Wood Wide Web begins, as many scientific revolutions do, with a puzzle. In the 1980s and 1990s, forests in British Columbia were changing. Logging, replanting and natural cycles left patches of young seedlings struggling under the shade of towering conifers. A forester named Suzanne Simard, raised among Canada's inland forests, noticed something unusual. Some seedlings thrived even in unlikely places, while others, despite good light and water, seemed to falter. She wondered why. Simard's upbringing made her attentive to forests in a way that was more than technical. She grew up in a family of loggers, surrounded by trees, not just as resources, but as neighbours, companions in a vast ecosystem. When she became a scientist, she carried this perspective with her, blending rigorous experiment with an instinct to look for hidden patterns. Her most famous experiment was deceptively simple. In 1997, she published a landmark study in Nature that traced the movement of carbon between two very different species, Douglas fir and paper birch. By labelling the trees with radioactive carbon isotopes, she showed that carbon compounds moved from one species to the other through shared fungal networks underground. It was a startling result. The implication was that trees could share resources across species boundaries. A birch could, in theory, supply sugars to a fir seedling, and the fir could return the favour in another season. For ecologists who had long thought of trees mainly as competitors for light and water, this was a paradigm shift. The forest was no longer just an arena of competition. It could also be a community of sharing. The image caught fire in the public imagination. Journalists seized on the metaphor of an underground internet where fungi acted as cables and trees as servers, exchanging data packets of sugar and nutrients. The term Wood Wide Web was coined, and it stuck. This metaphor resonated deeply outside of science. In an age when the actual internet was rapidly reshaping human life, the idea that forests had their own ancient version was irresistible. It seemed to confirm a sense many people already carried, that nature is deeply interconnected, that life is not just survival of the fittest, but cooperation at vast scales. Simard herself, in interviews and later in her 2021 memoir, Finding the Mother Tree, leaned into the idea that forests were social networks. She described mother trees, old giants whose vast root systems served as hubs, connecting with and nurturing younger seedlings. The image of a maternal figure in the forest feeding her young through hidden fungal threads was as poetic as it was scientific. Of course, as with many scientific breakthroughs, her findings sparked debate. Some researchers embraced the notion of cooperation, while others warned against anthropomorphism, the projection of human traits onto non-human life. Was a tree really nurturing its seedlings, or were carbon flows simply the byproducts of chemical gradients moving passively through fungal conduits? But whether one saw it as intentional support or passive process, the fact remained. Simard had uncovered evidence of a hidden network beneath the forest floor. The idea spread beyond academia. It made its way into documentaries, TED Talks, and even popular films. James Cameron's Avatar portrayed the fictional world of Pandora as a planet-wide wood wide web, where every tree and creature was linked through a neural-like network called Iowa. Viewers left theatres with the impression that our own forests might whisper in similar ways. The metaphor also found fertile ground in literature. Writers and poets seized on the imagery of underground conversations, of ancient beings trading wisdom in silence. It fit neatly into long traditions of animistic and indigenous worldviews, which had for centuries described forests as communities of living, communicating beings. Yet it is important to pause here. The origins of the idea were both rigorous and mythic. On one hand, Simard's experiments offered measurable evidence of carbon transfers mediated by fungi. On the other, the language of talking trees and motherly care grew from a human desire to see our own values reflected in the natural world. Science provided the data, culture provided the metaphor. That interplay between fact and imagination is what gave the Wood Wide Web its enduring power. It is also what set the stage for decades of debate. Was this truly a scientific discovery of cooperative forests? Or was it a compelling story, magnified by our hunger for connection in an age of fragmentation? Simard's work did something remarkable. It opened a window into the soil, revealing a complexity long overlooked. Most ecological studies had focused on what could be seen above ground: trunks, leaves, canopies, and the animals that moved among them. But the forest, it turned out, was just as alive below the surface, where roots and fungi formed a hidden architecture. It is perhaps fitting that the origins of this idea lie not in high-tech labs, but in the patient observation of a forester who grew up listening to forests with both scientific and cultural ears. From those beginnings, the Wood Wide Web would grow into one of the most captivating ecological concepts of the 21st century, celebrated, debated, and, as we'll see, questioned. For now, imagine the first glimmers of this discovery. Two trees, seemingly separate above ground, quietly linked below, sharing sugars in the dark. A finding simple enough to fit into a radioactive isotope graph, yet vast enough to reshape how millions of people imagine the life of forests. If we step away from the metaphor for a moment and look closely at the soil itself, the picture becomes at once less romantic and more astonishing. Beneath every forest lies a hidden kingdom of fungi. Unlike the mushrooms we see on the surface, the fruiting bodies that rise for only a few days, most fungal life exists underground as sprawling threads called hyphae. Each hypha is microscopic, but together they can grow into dense webs called mycelium, spreading meters, sometimes kilometers, through the soil. These filaments are thin, hollow tubes capable of transporting water, minerals, and other compounds. They are the scaffolding of what we call mycorrhizal networks. The word mycorrhiza comes from the Greek mykes, meaning fungus, and rhiza meaning root, quite literally fungus root, and that is the essence of the partnership. A mycorrhizal fungus attaches itself to a plant's roots, penetrating between or even inside root cells. The plant, through photosynthesis, produces sugars, carbohydrates that fungi cannot make for themselves. The fungus, in exchange, gathers nutrients from the soil, phosphorus, nitrogen, trace minerals that plants struggle to access. This trade, carbon for nutrients, is one of the most widespread symbiotic relationships on Earth. Roughly 90% of land plants form some kind of mycorrhizal partnership. From grasses to towering oaks, nearly all are plugged into this underground economy. There are different kinds of mycorrhiza. The two main categories are ectomycorrhiza and arbuscular mycorrhiza. Ectomycorrhizae wrap themselves around the outside of plant roots, forming a sheath. They send hyphae into the spaces between root cells, but not through the cells themselves. This type is common in trees such as pines, birches and oaks. If you've walked through a pine forest and seen mushrooms dotting the ground, chances are you've glimpsed the fruiting bodies of ectomycorrhizal fungi. Arbuscular mycorrhizae, by contrast, go inside. Their hyphae penetrate root cells and form tiny tree-like structures called arbuscules, hence the name. These arbuscules greatly increase the surface area for exchange, making nutrient transfer more efficient. Arbuscular mycorrhizae are ancient. Fossils suggest they existed over 400 million years ago, helping the first plants colonize land. What makes these relationships extraordinary is not just the one-to-one partnership between a plant and its fungal partner, but the fact that many fungi connect with multiple plants at once. A single fungus may colonize the roots of several different trees or shrubs, linking them together. When this happens, we get what scientists call a common mycorrhizal network, or CMN. In such a network, carbon compounds produced by one plant can move into the fungus and then appear in another plant connected to the same fungal system. Similarly, water and nutrients gathered by the fungus can be distributed across multiple hosts. In essence, the fungus becomes a shared infrastructure. Early experiments, like Suzanne Simard's in the 1990s, used radioactive carbon isotopes to trace these flows. More recent studies employ stable isotopes and sophisticated labeling techniques to detect movement of nitrogen, phosphorus, and even chemical signals. The evidence shows that these transfers do happen, though the scale and ecological importance are still debated. For instance, seedlings in deep shade often show signs of receiving carbon from neighbouring plants. In some cases, these transfers can mean the difference between survival and death. Fungi can act like pipelines, moving sugars from sunlit plants to shaded ones. But unlike human-designed pipelines, the flows are not controlled by conscious choice. They are governed by gradients, differences in concentration, that drive molecules from areas of abundance to areas of scarcity. Communication, in this biological sense, may also occur. Some experiments suggest that when one plant is attacked by pests, it releases chemical signals into its roots, which then travel through mycorrhizal networks and trigger defensive responses in neighbouring plants. These are not words, not whispers in any human sense, but biochemical alerts, like alarms carried through shared wiring. Still, it's important to scale our imagination correctly. A mycorrhizal network may connect a patch of forest across a few meters, sometimes tens of meters, but it does not extend seamlessly across hundreds of kilometers. Forests are mosaics multiple fungal species overlapping and competing, forming local clusters rather than one giant web. And fungi themselves are not impartial messengers. They can favour one plant over another. Studies show that fungi sometimes allocate more nutrients to plants that provide them with more carbon in return. In other words, the fungus is not a selfless courier. It has its own evolutionary interests. What looks like generosity between trees may simply be the outcome of fungal economics, yet even with these caveats, the picture remains astonishing. Forests are not collections of isolated individuals, but networks of interdependence. Roots and fungi together form a vast architecture that recycles nutrients, buffers stress, and shapes which plants thrive. Think of the soil as a kind of living fabric. Every root tip is a node, every fungal thread is a line of connection. Some lines are strong, thickened with carbon flows, others are faint, linking seedlings briefly before fading. This fabric is constantly shifting, threads forming, breaking, reweaving. From a scientific perspective, it is not magic, not a secret language of trees. It is biochemistry and physics, molecules moving along gradients, hyphae growing toward nutrients, roots responding to signals. Yet, to stand in a forest and know that beneath your feet this hidden network hums, silent and unseen, is no less wondrous. So, the Wood Wide Web is not exactly a global internet, but it is a reminder that life, even underground, is rarely solitary. Plants and fungi have been co-evolving for hundreds of millions of years, writing their connections into the very soil. And every time we walk through a forest, we walk across their quiet networks. As the idea of the Wood Wide Web spread beyond academic journals, something curious happened. The science, fascinating in its own right, began to grow taller in the public imagination, like a storybook tree, branches heavy with meanings not quite its own. And while this helped people connect emotionally to forests, it also blurred the line between fact and fable. Perhaps the most powerful image is that of a wise old giant, a mother tree sending sugars to its children in the shade, nourishing them until they can stand on their own. It's a moving vision, a parent figure in the forest, quietly caring for its kin. There is some truth here. Large, mature trees do connect to seedlings through fungal networks, and carbon can flow from older individuals into younger ones. Suzanne Simard's experiments showed this in Douglas firs, where shaded seedlings absorbed carbon that must have originated from nearby adults. But the interpretation is more complicated. The flows may not be acts of intentional nurturing. They could simply be the result of concentration gradients, sugars moving from where they are plentiful to where they are scarce. In that sense, the mother isn't choosing to feed her offspring. The fungus is simply acting as a conduit. Still, the outcome, seedlings surviving thanks to these transfers, remains remarkable, even if the motive is not motherly love. Popular writing also often describes forests as one giant organism, every tree linked in a seamless web. This image is enchanting, like something from mythology, but reality is messier. Forests are patchworks. Different fungal species create separate networks, some overlapping, some not. A pine may be linked to a birch through one fungal partner, while another nearby tree may be connected through a different species entirely. The networks are local, usually spanning meters to tens of meters, not hundreds. So while clusters of trees are indeed connected underground, the idea of an entire forest acting as one unified being is more poetic metaphor than ecological fact. Another exaggeration is the idea that these underground networks are governed by pure generosity. The Wood Wide Web is often painted as a utopia of sharing, where plants help one another selflessly. In truth, the underground economy is more complex. Fungi are not neutral wires, they are living organisms with their own needs. When given the choice, fungi often allocate more nutrients to plants that give them more carbon in return. In this sense, they reward the generous plants and neglect the stingier ones. And plants, too, can be selective. Some appear to favour certain fungal partners over others, shaping which species thrive in the soil. This makes the network less like a communal gift economy and more like a bustling marketplace, where exchanges are shaped by supply, demand, and bargaining power. That doesn't make it any less wondrous. If anything, it makes the hidden world under our feet even more fascinating, an ancient decentralized economy, humming without intention, yet sustaining entire forests. Headlines also often proclaim that trees communicate through fungi, warning neighbours of insect attacks or sharing chemical signals. There is some basis for this. In experiments, plants linked by mycorrhizal networks have been shown to prime their defences when a neighbour is attacked. Defensive enzymes and chemicals appear sooner, as if the plant had been warned. But again, we must be careful with language. Communication, in human terms, implies intent, a choice to send a message, and another choice to understand it. In plants, the process is chemical and automatic. One root leaks compounds into the network. Another root detects them and responds. It's not a conversation in words, but a chain reaction in molecules. To call this talking may inspire awe, but it risks misleading. Better, perhaps, to think of it as signalling, like electrical sparks in a circuit, rather than whispers in the dark. The scale is often overstated too. These underground networks do not connect entire continents or stretch unbroken across mountain ranges. They are local, patchy, and overlapping. A network may bind a cluster of trees together, but just meters away, a different network might dominate. So rather than one vast, unbroken net, forests are a quilt of overlapping webs, each one intricate, each one vital. Even stripped of myths, what remains is extraordinary. The Wood Wide Web shows that trees are not isolated towers competing only for light, but participants in a dynamic underground community. Carbon, nutrients, and signals move between species. Shade-loving seedlings gain a foothold thanks to their neighbours. Distress signals ripple through roots and fungi. The myths may overstate intention and scale, but the reality remains powerful. Forests are not just collections of individuals, but networks of interaction. It's natural that our imaginations rushed ahead of the data. We are storytellers by nature, and the thought of trees whispering through hidden threads is almost too beautiful to resist. Scientists, though, remind us to step carefully, to celebrate the wonder of what is real, even as we enjoy the poetry of what might be. And perhaps that's the balance to hold, to marvel at the networks without needing them to be exactly like our own. They are not the internet, they are not mothers in the human sense. They are something older, stranger, and, in their own way, just as miraculous. In recent years, the Wood Wide Web has entered a new phase, not of discovery, but of debate. The early experiments were small, often carried out in greenhouses or tightly controlled plots, where seedlings in pots were linked by fungi and then observed for carbon transfers. These studies revealed tantalizing hints of underground sharing. But the question has always lingered: what happens in the complexity of a real forest, with dozens of species, layers of soil, shifting light, drought, insects, and competing fungi? From 2023 onward, several researchers began voicing concerns that the sweeping claims made in popular accounts were running far ahead of the data. Reviews in prominent ecology journals emphasized that while carbon transfer is possible, its scale and significance in natural forests remain uncertain. The metaphor of trees talking, or of ancient giants deliberately nurturing their offspring, was criticized as anthropomorphism, a projection of human values onto processes that are chemical and automatic. Sugars do move through fungal threads, but does that mean intention? Does it mean altruism? To some scientists, these words risk confusing the public about what the evidence truly shows. At the same time, other voices pushed back. They argued that while metaphors may stretch, they serve a purpose. To call a tree nurturing or to describe signals as communication helps people care, helps forests become more than background scenery. For many ecologists who spend their lives studying trees, the metaphors are bridges, ways of translating complex biochemistry into language that sparks imagination. The danger, they admit, lies not in using metaphors, but in forgetting that they are metaphors. The debate often comes down to framing. On one side are those who want the language of forests to remain cautious, stripped of human-like imagery, focused on measurable quantities. On the other side are those who see storytelling as part of science, as long as it is clear where data ends and poetry begins. Both perspectives share the same desire, to understand and to protect, but they diverge in how best to speak about what lies underground. Meanwhile, the experiments themselves are evolving. New studies, carried out in full forest conditions, have attempted to track carbon transfer not just between pairs of trees in pots, but across entire plots of living ecosystems. These large-scale tests often involve labelling trees with isotopes, then watching to see if any signal shows up in neighbouring individuals over months or years. The results are nuanced. Transfers can occur, but they are often smaller than imagined, sometimes barely detectable, and they don't always lead to clear benefits for the receiving plant. In some cases, the flows are measurable but ecologically insignificant, like a faint trickle compared to the plant's overall budget. Still, there are moments where the findings hint at larger importance. For instance, in stressed environments, drought, shade, nutrient-poor soils, the small transfers may matter more, tipping the balance between survival and death. In these contexts, the Wood Wide Web could function as a safety net, not a constant lifeline, but a subtle buffer that increases resilience. This too fuels debate. Some scientists emphasize that without strong, consistent evidence of widespread benefits, we should be careful not to paint forests as cooperative utopias. Others counter that even modest transfers, multiplied across thousands of connections and decades of growth, could add up to significant effects. The truth may be somewhere in between, networks that are neither perfectly harmonious nor irrelevant, but patchy systems whose impacts wax and wane with conditions. The criticism has also turned inward toward the scientific community itself. Some ecologists worry that the mythologizing of the Wood Wide Web distracts from urgent, practical issues like deforestation, invasive pests, or climate change. If the public sees forests only as mystical webs of communication, it may obscure the harsher realities of logging, warming, and biodiversity loss. Others reply that, on the contrary, the metaphor draws attention and builds empathy, making conservation efforts stronger. After all, people protect what they feel connected to. In 2024 and 2025, The debate reached a kind of crossroads. Papers appeared that directly challenged the notion of mother trees, pointing out the lack of strong evidence for deliberate kin support in wild forests. At the same time, other studies emphasized the resilience role of fungal diversity, showing how networks can support seedlings in disturbed areas. The clash was not between believers and skeptics, but between different emphases, the scale and intent of these networks, the language used to describe them, and the weight they carry in our models of forest ecology. What emerges from this scientific back and forth is not disillusionment, but refinement. The wood wide web remains real, fungi do connect trees, and transfers do occur. But the picture is subtler than early enthusiasm suggested. It is not an internet, not a forest-wide consciousness. It is a set of local, overlapping systems, sometimes cooperative, sometimes competitive, often invisible in their impact. And perhaps this debate is a healthy sign. Science is not a monologue but a conversation, shifting as new data arrives. The fact that researchers are challenging, testing, and probing the claims shows that the idea has matured from metaphor into a serious field of study. For those listening quietly in the forest, the difference may not matter. The sense of awe remains the same, whether we imagine trees whispering or understand them as exchanging molecules. Either way, beneath the soil, life is weaving connections that humans are only beginning to untangle. And in the slow rhythm of roots and fungi, the debate continues, not in words, but in silent flows of carbon, traced patiently by those who kneel in the dirt to follow them. When we step back from the debates over metaphors and mechanisms, what remains is the undeniable role these fungal networks play in the larger story of forests. Even if they are not motherly conversations or conscious acts of sharing, common mycorrhizal networks still shape how forests grow, adapt, and endure. Their influence emerges most clearly in resilience, how trees and plants survive challenges, recover from disturbances, and persist across generations. One of the clearest examples is the establishment of seedlings in deep shade. Young trees sprouting under a closed canopy often receive too little sunlight to produce enough sugars through photosynthesis. On their own, many would die before reaching the light, but when linked into a fungal network, these seedlings may receive trickles of carbon from larger, sunlit neighbours. The transfer is rarely generous in absolute terms, but for a fragile seedling, even small supplements can tip the balance towards survival. In this way, networks become bridges, allowing the next generation to take hold in places where otherwise they would wither. Resilience also shows itself after disturbances, fires, windstorms, or human logging. In landscapes where old trees remain scattered among the cleared or damaged patches, fungal networks often persist underground. These remnants can help new growth establish more quickly, funneling nutrients and water into regenerating seedlings. It is as if the forest has a hidden memory beneath the soil, a continuity that allows recovery to unfold not from nothing, but from threads that never disappeared. Central to this resilience is diversity, not only of trees, but of fungi themselves. A single forest may host dozens, even hundreds, of fungal species, each with slightly different abilities. Some are efficient at extracting phosphorus, others at channeling nitrogen. Some form broad, shallow webs, while others burrow deeper, drawing water from reserves far underground. Together, they create a mosaic of capacities, a network that is more robust precisely because it is varied. If one species falters, another may step in. If drought stresses shallow-rooted trees, deeper networks may carry the burden. Diversity is, in this sense, the immune system of the forest, preventing collapse by distributing functions across many actors, but these hidden architectures are not immune to change. Climate shifts are already altering their dynamics in ways subtle and profound. Warming temperatures can shift the balance of fungal communities, favouring some species while suppressing others. Changes in rainfall patterns influence not only tree growth above ground, but the microbial traffic below. Droughts may reduce the flow of carbon from trees into fungi, starving networks that depend on steady sugar supplies. In turn, fungi, weakened by lack of resources, may fail to deliver nutrients back, creating a feedback loop of stress. Deforestation adds another layer of disruption. When large areas of forest are cleared, networks that took decades or centuries to establish are severed in an instant. Soil exposed to sunlight dries and heats, killing sensitive fungal threads. Even when trees are replanted, the new seedlings often grow without the intricate partnerships that once nourished their predecessors. Restoration ecology increasingly recognizes that replanting trees alone is not enough. The underground webs must be restored as well, or the new forests may never achieve the same resilience. There are also invisible pressures from pollutants and shifting chemistry in the soil. Increased nitrogen deposition from agriculture and industry can overwhelm delicate balances, making some fungal partners less necessary or even harmful. Acidification alters which species thrive, potentially narrowing diversity. What was once a broad, flexible network can become simplified and therefore more fragile under human influence. Yet there are signs of adaptation. Some fungi appear remarkably flexible, adjusting to new hosts, shifting their strategies as conditions change. Trees, too, are not passive. They can alter root growth, exude different chemicals, or shift partnerships depending on which fungi are available. These dynamics suggest that while the wood wide web is vulnerable, it is not brittle. It bends, reshapes, and sometimes surprises us with its persistence. For forest managers and conservationists, understanding these networks has practical value. Seedlings, introduced into restoration projects, fare better when inoculated with appropriate fungi. Efforts to conserve biodiversity increasingly consider not just charismatic animals or visible plants, but the invisible mycelial threads that sustain them. Protecting a forest now means protecting both what is seen above the soil and what is hidden below. On a broader scale, these networks remind us of the interconnectedness of climate, ecology, and human action. The carbon locked in soils, the resilience of forests under warming, the recovery from logging or fire, all are shaped by the fungal threads beneath. They may not be mystical, but they are foundational, playing roles in cycles that extend from a single seedling to the atmosphere itself, and so the implications ripple outward. A tree standing tall is not only an individual, but also the visible tip of an unseen collaboration. When forests endure drought, rebound from storms, or fail to recover after destruction, part of the story lies underground. To see the wood wide web not as a myth but as an ecological reality is to recognize the delicate, powerful role of fungi in keeping forests alive. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Resilience is not built on isolated strength, but on quiet connections. The forest's endurance depends on countless unseen threads, each one fragile, yet together capable of holding entire ecosystems in place. And as our climate shifts and our forests strain, the survival of those connections may determine much of what endures on this living planet. The Wood Wide Web has always been more than a scientific discovery. It became a story, one that answered a quiet yearning in us. The notion that trees are connected beneath the soil, that they might share resources or signals, reflects our own longing for kinship and community. It tells us that connection is not unique to humans, that it is a pattern etched into life itself. Science, however, is cautious. It reminds us to temper metaphors with measurements, to separate intention from chemistry. Trees do not whisper in words, fungi do not choose to nurture. What passes through the soil is not kindness, but molecules flowing according to gradients and biology. To some, this stripping away of poetry seems to diminish the wonder, but in truth, it deepens it. The reality is extraordinary enough. For hundreds of millions of years, fungi and plants have built partnerships that allowed green life to thrive on land. Without those threads, forests would not rise, rivers would run differently, the air itself would not carry the oxygen we breathe. Even without myth, the forest remains a place of connection. Each tree is both individual and part of a larger weave. Each fungus follows its own survival, yet together they create resilience. It is not a conscious web, not a superorganism, but something stranger. Cooperation without thought, networks without awareness, an ecosystem where balance emerges from countless interactions. In their silence, forests remind us that interdependence does not require intention to be real. And still, the story matters. To speak of mother trees and whispering roots may not be precise, but it stirs care. It invites people to look at forests with gentler eyes, to see them as more than lumber or scenery. Science gives us accuracy, stories give us meaning. Between them, we find both understanding and reverence. Perhaps the truest way to honour the Wood Wide Web is to hold both perspectives at once, to marvel at the measurable flows of carbon and nutrients, and to allow the metaphor of connection to remind us of our place in the living world. The forest does not need our words to be wondrous, but our words may help us remember to protect it. So as you imagine the soil beneath your feet, threads of fungi weaving, roots touching in the dark, let yourself rest in that dual awareness. There is science in the silence, and there is story. There is no need to decide between them. Both are true in their own way. And as this thought settles, picture yourself lying under the canopy once more. The air is still. The leaves above move softly. Beneath, unseen, connections hold the forest together. Connections that are older than us and will outlast us. You do not need to hear them to know they are there. You only need to rest and trust in the quiet resilience of the earth.